Part 3. The Religious Nature. Aphorism 45. The human soul, in its frontiers, the compass of human inner experience, is general attained hitherto, the heights, depths, and distance of this experience, the entire history of the soul hitherto, in its still unexhausted possibilities. This is the predestined hunting ground for a born psychologist and lover of the big game hunt. But how often must we say despairingly to himself, one man, alas, but one man, in this great forest and jungle, and thus he wishes he had a few hundred beaters, and subtle, well-instructed tractor dogs whom he could send into the history of the human soul, and there round up his game. In vain, he discovers again and again, thoroughly and bitterly, how hard it is to find beaters and dogs for all the things which arouse his curiosity. The drawback in sending scholars out into new and dangerous hunting grounds, where courage, prudence, subtlety, in every sense, are needed, is that they cease to be of any use precisely where the big hunt, but also the big danger begins, precisely where do they lose their keenness of eye and keenness of nose. To divine and establish, for example, what sort of history the problem of knowledge and conscience has had in the soul of Harmones Religii, one would oneself perhaps have to be as profound, as wounded, as monstrous as Pascal's intellectual conscience was, and then there would still be needed that broad heaven of bright, malicious spirituality, capable of looking down on this turmoil of dangerous and painful experiences, surveying and ordering them and forcing them into formulas. But how could do me this service? And who would at the same time to wait for such servants? They appear too rarely. They are all at all times so very improbable. In the end, one has to do everything oneself, if one is to know a few things oneself. That is to say, one has much to do. But a curiosity like mine is, after all, the most pleasurable of vices. I beg your pardon. I meant to say, the love of truth has its reward in heaven, and already upon earth. Aphorism 46. The faith, such as primitive Christianity, demanded and not infrequently obtained in the midst of a skeptical and southernly free-spirited world, with a centuries-long struggle between philosophical schools behind it and in it, plus the education and tolerance provided by the Imperium Romanum. This faith is not that gruff, true-hearted Leigman's faith which a Luther, say, or a Cromwell, or some other northern barbarian of the spirit cleaved to his God in his Christianity. It is rather that faith of Pascal, which resembles in a terrible fashion a protracted suicide of reason, of a tough, long-lived, worm-like reason which is not to be killed instantaneously with a single blow. The Christian faith is from the beginning sacrifice, sacrifice of all freedom, all pride, all self-confidence of the spirit, at the same time enslavement and self-mockery, self-mutilation. There is cruelty in religious fanaticism, and this faith exacted an overripe, manifold, and much indulged conscience. Its self-presupposition presupposition is that the subjection of the spirit is indescribably painful, that the entire past and habitude of such a spirit resists the absurdism which faith appears to it to be. Modern men, with their obtuseness to all Christian nomenclature, no longer sense the gruesome superlative which lay for an antique taste in the paradoxical formula God on the cross. Never and nowhere has there hitherto been a comparable boldness and inversion, anything so fearsome, questioning, and questionable. As this formula, it promised a revaluation of all antique value. It is the Orient, the innermost Orient. It is the Oriental slave who, in this fashion, took vengeance on Rome and its noble and frivolous tolerance, on Roman Catholicism of faith. And it has never been faith, but always freedom from faith, that half stoical and smiling unconcerned masters and against their masters. With with all of this serious faith, then has engaged with the slaves. Enlightenment enrages, for the slave wants the unconditional. He understands, in the domain of morality, too, only the tyrannical. He loves as he hates, without nuance, into the depths of man, to the point of pain, to the point of sickness. The great hidden suffering he feels is enraged at the noble taste which seems to deny suffering, skepticism towards suffering, at bottom, no more than a pose of aristocratic morality, was likewise not the least contributory cause of the last great slave revolt, which began with the French Revolution. Welcome, everyone, to a fresh angle of me and fresh lighting. Today we begin with, with Nietzsche's notorious ragdoll and punching bag religion, primarily Protestant, both Orthodox and liberal Protestant Christianity. People interpret that it's Christianity itself. Yes, he's criticizing the entirety of it, but because of how Protestantism dominated Europe and it migrated to North America, he's critiquing liberal and Orthodox Protestantism, while to a degree lenient with Catholicism. It's a rarity with Nietzsche. He's rarely lenient with his punches, or some of his witful comments. We begin first with the human soul, in that hitherto it was the height, the heights, the depths, and the distance of this experience. It was the entire history of this soul hitherto, or before this time, that it became an unexhausted possibilities, aka it was predestined for hunting game, or the big game, the big hunt game, which was to birth a psychologist and the lover of this game, aka the free spirit. And to a degree, if the free spirit, excuse me, I'm burping again, if the free spirit develops in his life with self cultivation, acceptance of his fate, lovingly and actively, etc., that person could plausibly become the Uberman, or the Overman, or Superman, not the DC comic character. But he says, often must we say despairingly to oneself, one man, alas, but one man, and this great forest and jungle, his territories for himself for the game of life. Thus he's tackling, surviving willingly. It's not the survival of the fittest motto, which is not Charles Darwin, it's Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer was not a student, not physically a student, but he studied Charles Darwin. To separate the two, Herbert Spencer was fond of self-preservation. Charles Darwin wasn't. In this sense, survival isn't merely existing in self-preservation, but it's to increase the power inside a person, while the fittest, or a noble, free spirit, actively affirms his fate and realizes that pain is a necessity inside man to grow power. And thus he wishes that he had a few hundred beaters and subtle, well-trained tractor dogs whom he could send into the history of the human soul, and were round up his gang. He'll continue forward with this. In vain, he discovers again and again, thoroughly and bitterly, how hard it is to find beaters and dogs for all of the things which arouse his curiosity. The key word, curiosity. We arrive at a time of our lives where curiosity becomes a vice or a wrongdoing, a sin, to say, something that causes a malediction or curse upon us. And he's correlating that with the beaters and well-trained dogs who patrol, monitor, and roam inside your head to stop the curiosity, which befalls some vein in the existence of curiosity inside of person. Because Nietzsche correlates curiosity with an innocent person or innocent child, and he loves using child analogies. He'll say childish in the form of these people don't know what they're talking about. They're being childish. They're being obnoxious, etc., etc. But he uses another form of child of that they're innocent while forgetting a perpetual will, a prodigal, a yes saying to life while experimenting, curious, creative, and wanders. There's a I I relate deeply with the innocent child analogy where I'll enter a phase, or not a phase. I'll enter a hip, a hypnotic state and mesmerized with the ideas, passions, desires, and everything that fights and combats those three words I said. And I love that mental battlefield inside me. And what results from it is curious of how I react to myself actively. The drawback in sending scholars out into the new and dangerous hunting grounds where they cease to be of any use precisely where the big hunt itself will use courage, prudence, and subtlety in every sense are needed in that. But also the big danger begins too with the big hunt. Okay, he's saying the scholars, while they're confident, they're prudent at the same time, and calculating every move, every subtlety and every sense of the big hunt, while ceasing to act and execute the actions for this hunt. And he continues forward. This is precisely where they lose their keenness of eye and keenness of nose. So correlating our human senses and animal senses, both herbivores and omnivores. Well, people say there's passive. They're both passive and to a degree. I'd say they're in a state of carelessness till it's time for till it's time for a feast because they're starving. Hence the hunt. To divine and establish, for example, what sort of history and problem of knowledge and science has had in the soul of humans religiosae. It's Latin for religious people. Inside the soul of religious people, one would stuttering. One would oneself perhaps have to be as profound as wounded and as monstrous as Pascal's intellectual conscience. That's the first time we're hearing Pascal, or the second time, but we'll hear him for a third time. Either the first or second time we're hearing Pascal in Nietzsche's work. The wisely saying Pascal is a profound but wounded and monstrous person, the same as these religious people who are creating the issue of divine knowledge, divine conscience, while at the same time separating what true conscience and true knowledge are versus what untrue and untrue is. He's including the Pascal's intellectual conscience. If you've heard of Pascal's square, where it's a mathematical, complex, and nuanced system where it results of the truth of every person. You don't believe in God? You don't believe in God. There's a place for you. You do believe in God? There's a place for you. His underneath his square concept is the prejudice of him to people to convert to his agenda and ideology. And then there would still be needed the broad heaven of bright, malicious spirituality, capable of looking down on this turmoil of dangerous and painful experiences, surveying and ordering them, and forcing them into formulas, aka Pascal's square. There's another formula I'm thinking of, the table of categories of Kant, where it's multiple upon multiple categories of how the brain perceives or the consciousness, it perceives reality and produces an image while processing of how he perceives the object versus the subject. That's another formula of something that's turmoil of dangerous and painful experiences, and the surveying and ordering them into formulas. One example. Another one is the categorical imperative. Another one is the Platonic world of ideas. Some people say the Aristotle's eudaimonia and the stoical I can't pronounce it. I think I can pronounce it. The stoical anaxagoria. However you, if the word was in front of me, I'd pronounce it. But it's the state of non-reactionary self-control. It's the number one form of self-control, self-mastery, and stillness plus non-reactive, complete non-reactive. But who could do me this service? At what time should I wait for these servants to brew up this formula? They appear too rarely. They are at all times so very improbable. And in the end, one has to do everything himself. If one is to know a few things himself or oneself, that is to say, one has much to do. But curiosity like mine is after all the most pleasurable of vices. I beg your pardon. I meant to say, the love of truth has its reward in heaven, and already upon earth. We've tackled, wrestled, and to me, we've triumphed at what Nietzsche is saying of the love of truth, or the will to truth. This obsession of truth. Now he's correlating this truth to the gift or reward in heaven. And that gift is eternal, being painless, joyful eternally, and satiated too. This is where it strikes me, where curiosity, like mine, is after all the most pleasurable of vices. Well, I beg your pardon. This this love of what I think it's truth has become a reward in heaven, already upon earth. AKA, it's a sarcasm. He's altering his perspective sarcastically, where, oh, this curiosity has become a vice now. Oh, I beg your pardon. Let me go over to this love of truth. And it'll be something grateful for me in heaven. It already has on earth. Why not can it be on another place? A hinterwelt or a beyond world. That's a sarcasm to finish everything. If I had to summarize what Nietzsche's saying in 45, is curiosity with nuance. That's how I'll summarize 45. Now 46 is saying that now this faith of the primitive Christianity demanded and not infrequently obtained in the midst of a skeptical and southernly free-spirited world, with a centuries-long struggle between philosophical schools behind it and inside of it, plus the education and tolerance of of the of, by the Imperium Romanum, aka the Roman Empire. The what he's saying of the school of tolerance, when Christianity or the cult of Christ, how the Romans coined them, because Christians coined the word pagan. Its Latin roots is panogos, rustic, and old, is how the translation in Latin is. Now, when the cult of Christ or Christianity and other religions were existing and erecting themselves in the Roman Empire, it became a tolerance, religious tolerance among them, because they were segregated to Judea at first once the Roman Empire conquered Judea. And today that would be modern day Israel and other territories in the premise of Israel. And they slowly migrated to the capital, and they Christianized the capital courtesy of Constantine. People say Constantine the Great. With me, I have a handful of greats in history. And now with this primitive Christianity, it became this, amidst this skeptical and southernly free-spirited world, he loves using compass analogies, where the north is these uh, uh brisk, tough, grit, and what's another word? Strong. And you can use that word. Strong people who could tolerate and actively absorb the northern winds and cold, while the southern individuals, not in the south of the United States, plausibly, but this is not what he's saying here, where he uses the South as hot-headed, ill-tempered, and irascible or easy to provoke people. So he's comparing it to one's calm-minded and the other is tempered. And that it became a centuries-long tension between the two philosophical schools, which he would name in Genealogy and Morals. It was inevitable for me to say this, but he would name them as master and slave morality, the two schools. But this faith is not that gruff, true-hearted Leibniz's faith with which Luther said, or Cromwell, or some other northern barbarian of that spirit cleaved to his God and his Christianity. It is rather that the faith of Pascal, second or third time, which resembles in a terrible fashion a protracted suicide of reason, of a tough, long-winded, worm-like reason which is not to be killed instantaneously with a single blow. That single blow is arduous because Nietzsche's grand politics and goal is to, okay, so it took 2,000 years for Christianity to triumph. Now, because I'm saying this here, my proposition is I would lay the seeds for another 2,000 years to reverse this. And this is beyond it, blatantly beyond his time and beyond my time too, and other people. So it's a long-term effect with gratification as a result. And he includes Luther and Cromwell. Cromwell was a Puritanist no, not Puritanist, Puritan, as a form of Lutheran doctrine. And to clarify, in this sense, Northern barbarians he uses as criticism. They had the spirit to cleave or split and separate to his God and his Christianity. Because of these Northern barbarians, barbarian is a now an English word, but in Greek it was barbaros or barbaroi. I think barbaroi, which translates to foreign. So these northern foreigners, aka the pagans at one time, split their spirit to Lutherans' God and Christianity. And then Cromwell, um, his invasion and gruesome attacks on Ireland were primarily Catholic versus his Puritan religion. So that's what he was saying. It can't be this worm-like reason. It can't be instantaneously killed with one blow, because it was the reversal. The single blow was the will to truth of this protracted suicide of reason from Pascal's intellectual conscience and square. That it became that suicide. Well, no, reason committed this suicide from this tough, long-lived, worm-like reason that we recycle and regurgitate every single day. We're unconscious of it too. The Christian faith is from the beginning sacrifice. Sacrifice of what? Freedom, pride, self-confidence inside the spirit, and superseding what I said to self-flagellation, self-mortification, and enslavement to another person's will. Either physical, metaphysical, divine, or not divine. Nietzsche said this multiple times before part 3, inside part 2, and inside of part 1. So just watch my other videos, and it will clarify of the sacrifice that he's proposing here, but in another context of the philosopher and scholar, or other individuals who sacrifice their will for this truth. But he continues forward. There is a cruelty in religious monasticism in this faith exacted an overripe, manifold, and much indulged conscience. Its proposition, or presupposition, is that the subjection of the spirit is indescribably painful. That the entire past and habitude of such a spirit resides the absurdism, absurdism, or translate from French, the absurd, which faith appears to be modern men, with their obtuseness to all Christian nomenclature. Why am I pronouncing that slow? I know, I can define that word. That word's simple to define. No longer sense the gruesome superlative which lay for the antique taste in the paradoxical formula, God cross. To simplify what he's saying here, with these renamed and labeled Christian terms, aka these nomenclatures, have the sense of the gruesome superlativeness, which, if you translate, it became a gruesome picture and analogy for an antique taste, but at the same time, while it became this gruesome imagery for this good taste, which inevitably became a bad taste, is the contradictory of why is there a God on the cross? And this became the obtuseness, or the obtuse angle. If you're familiar with it, you're familiar. If you're not, Google it. It became the symbolic representation of sacrifice, reverence, and respect. Never and nowhere has there hitherto been a comparable boldness and invasion, anything so far questioning and questionable as the formula. It promised a revaluation of all antique values. He says antique values here, but it's revaluation of values. It is Orient, the innermost Orient. It is the Oriental slave who, in this fashion, took revenge on Rome, and its noble and frivolous tolerance on Roman Catholicism of faith, aka the Renaissance, where Martin Luther nailed his 95, was it 95, 93, his 90 something theses on the cathedral door, which is fictitious. He printed pamphlets for people to read. And once these Oriental slaves, he'll clarify everything, what he's saying here in the genealogy of morals. People would say, well, why are you reading the part 3 of Beyond Good and Evil when he can clarify everything in genealogy of morals? This is the early stage of his maturity. Well, yes, it was published in 1886, but this is the early stage of his maturity of this topic, and he'll have a mature mindset or mature mentality in genealogy and morals. But the vengeance or resentment on Rome and its noble and frivolous tolerance was the same thing in the Roman Catholicism, revaluing values that continue to today. And it has never been faith, but always freedom from faith, that half stoical and smiling unconcern with the seriousness of faith that has engaged slaves in their masters and against their masters. Enlightenment enrages, for the slave wants the unconditional. He wants to understand in the domain of the morality too only the tyrannical. He loves as he hates, without nuance, into the depths of him, to the point of pain, to the point of sickness, this great hidden suffering. He feels is enraged at the noble taste which seems to deny suffering. Skepticism towards suffering. At bottom, no more than a pose of aristocratic morality, was likewise not in the least contributory cause of the last great slave revolt, which began with the French Revolution. And if you're familiar with the French Revolution and Nietzsche's perspective of revolution/war, he realized that it's inevitable for desire for violence inside humans, and that it erupted. It became a social catharsis for the French, for the individuals who enacted the war or the revolution. But he realized that this slave revolt was for liberty, freedom, and brotherhood, which was a regurgitation, in other words, of Christian faith and virtue. Everything he says in that final sentence is blunt and straightforward. There's a link in the description for the Men's Academy. I'm inside the Academy. Amor Fati. Love your fate.